The game was just starting to become really hard for me to get through.
What is going on? What is this story?
Just why? Why is this a thing? Not only because of every issue I had, but also because of this. And you know what? That's one of my biggest complaints with P3. Welcome back to our third episode of Persona-thon, the series where we give an overall look back on the history and changes throughout the Persona series. We are now reaching the PS2 titles, and let's kick it off with Persona 3. Oh, jeez, now this is interesting. Persona 3 is both a game I know a lot, and yet nothing about. This was the last game I had to check out before making this series, yet I still knew a lot about it regarding the character, story, gameplay. Heck, I can even name you all the main differences with FES and Portable. But whatever the case is, as always, if you want to stay updated on more productions like this, be sure to press that red button. This is our review on Persona 3. So the year is 2003. Wow, that's new. Alright, 2003. Nocturne released and development officially began for P3. However, things were definitely different. The new hardware not only gave more possibilities for ideas, it also made games really stand out from each other with their gameplay and art styles. This did get art director Shigenori Sojima in a complicated spot. Wait, you might be saying, what happened to the creators of the series? Like Kazuma Kaneto? Well, about that. Sojima actually got the job from Kaneto to gain some experience. This gave him a lot of pressure since he didn't want to disappoint fans. Keep in mind that while Atlus wasn't the biggest company compared to now, during this time they did have a very passionate fan base. Fortunately, Sojima came up with a new direction for the art style. As stated in an interview, he decided to go with a style reminiscent of animes and manga at the time. There was an emphasis on the UI, making it much more appealing to stand out in its marketing. That in full anime cutscenes. Say goodbye to that jank 3D animation and say hello to fancy 2D. This is only scratching the surface of the many additions made onto Persona 3. The PS2 hardware really gave developers new ideas to implement. They really wanted to push the idea of overcoming the fear of death, so they did this by making the characters AI controlled. And the way you could make them stronger is by increasing their bonds with each of them. There were a lot of things cut too, however. For example, the demon negotiation system for Persona 1 and 2 was completely removed, though this was also where the famous social link system was introduced. As a whole, there's generally not so much that needs to be said, or let alone has been documented on this game's development. Anyhow, Persona 3 eventually got its release on July 13th, 2003 Japan, August 14th, 2007 in the US, and February 29th, 2008 in Europe.
And as usual, I'll go over the story. Well, the story is kind of easier to follow this time around. You play as Makoto Yuki, a transfer student who moved to the city after a fatal incident that happened to both of his parents. You just try to get through school as usual. However, there's been some strange activity going around the city. This is all a cause of a rising number of people with apathy syndrome, a condition that's plagued across the area. This is how you find out the truth behind your classmates. You see, the thing about these guys is that they're part of the Specialized Extracurricular Execution Squad, or SEES for short. These guys basically try to defeat any monsters that are lurking around. Said monsters, also known as shadows, appear on what's called the Dark Hour, a hidden part of the day that only happens during midnight. Only those powerful enough can access the Dark Hour, so it's up to you, Yukari, Mitsuru, Akihiko, and many more faces you meet to see who's truly behind the Dark Hour. And well, yeah, that's kind of it really. The thing about Persona 3 to 5 is that they have simpler conflicts and ideas, but they make up for it by creating a new world and some lore around it. And that's kind of why I'll be a bit more brief on these summaries. I'll be sure to mention any major events though. So, what do I think? I didn't like this story, for the most part. Let's get this out of the way. I really like the concept. The thing about Persona 3 most different in the whole series is the tone itself. This game thrives off of a dark, more serious, more mature kind of story, and it does it really well. Since the beginning, you feel a sense of fear and mystery. What is going on? Why are there these incidents? Why is there a hidden hour that people are turning into this? These are all questions I was asking myself. Not to mention some of the disturbing imagery, like how did you summon a persona? You summon a persona by shooting yourself. What? Combine that with the lighting, the music, everything. It just all goes so well together. Oh, and don't get me started with the themes here. The fear of death is one of the main things you encounter, and we see most, if not all, the characters having to deal with it one way or another. I kid you not, we have Ken, a literal child, having to see someone who he wanted to kill die in front of his face. Speaking of which, I might as well talk about who's really behind the Dark Hour. Well, you see, we initially think it's these 12 big shadows represented by the Arcanas, basically like the names that you had for different personas like Fool, Lovers, Empress, etc. So according to our chairman, Ikutsuki, defeating them, we will put an end to the Dark Hour. However, oh god, I need to talk about this scene. Okay, so after defeating the 12 shadows, we meet up with Ikutsuki, who, for some reason, does a massive 180 turn and tells us this was all part of his plan just to reunite the shadows for this end of the world deal. When things couldn't get any worse, after we defeat him, we also get introduced to this one new character who there's no build up on, called Ryoji, who later gets revealed he is the last of the shadows from the Arcana, who by the end of January will turn into a god called Nyx, who wants to destroy humanity. Like, what is going on? What is this story? Okay, sorry about that. Let me explain. So, yes, you fight this final god from this dude you randomly meet called Ryoji. And well, what he's supposed to do, he's basically telling you that he's the final Arcana. And by the end of January, he's gonna turn into Nyx and wants to destroy humanity. So you can either fight him, who is supposedly unbeatable, or you can just accept death. The reason I'm getting so worked up about this is because it really just doesn't explain it too well, or it doesn't have like a good build up. At most, I guess one of your party members remembers about Ryoji by meeting him in the Dark Hour and starts going into a fight with him. Maybe it's just me, maybe I forgot any context prior, but I do not remember anything I just mentioned about this Ryoji guy at all. And that's just Ryoji. Don't even get me started with Ikutsuki. He just has a complete 180 turn in his character. He went from a really nice and funny guy to suddenly acting like he's some cult leader. He crucifies us and asks Aigis to kill us. What? I genuinely liked the story. I liked where it was going with the 12 shadows, but when it was going into this part of the game, it just went so out of nowhere. It took me by surprise. I didn't know what was going on. It's not all bad though. The ending after you defeat Nyx, seeing the protagonist just accept death and sacrifice himself for the better of others, that was a pretty decent ending. While I wasn't a big fan of this cast in general, I will admit some of the character interactions have been adorable to see. For example, we have Junpei, one of the C's members, and Chidori, a member of another team called Strega. These guys are basically just one of the few antagonists you see along the way. Back to these two, however. So Junpei initially doesn't know that Chidori is part of Strega, but he does open up to her and talk about how he wants to be a leader. However, this ultimately backfired. So we go out there and try to save Junpei and also capture Chidori, who we later take to the hospital to get some intel about Strega. We don't really get much info from her, but we do get to see a little bit of a chemistry between her and Junpei. Initially, she was very scared of the idea of feeling attached to someone, but she ended up accepting that and even helped save Junpei from dying, all at the cost of her own life. This was, in my opinion, one of the best arcs in the entire game. Seeing those small moments with the two and how much Junpei cares for Chidori, someone who originally hated him, to now being someone who wants to be with him, is really heartwarming. This just further exemplifies how prominent death is throughout the game. The other characters are fine, I guess. I don't know, they just felt all very dry as a whole. We don't get to see them open up until way later down the line, like around halfway through the game. I get what they're doing. They basically want to make the character arcs and development more realistic as a gradual thing than rather just them being friends on the first day. And that's fine, I admire it. It's just not a writing style that I'd associate with something like Persona. This sounds more like it's in line with something like Megaten. On top of that, some of the development really isn't good. Ken's whole ordeal to his mom dying isn't really touched on too much other than the set date. I mean, credit where credit is due. I'd say Akihiko and Shinjiro's friendship is probably one of the coolest parts of the game as well, but I still didn't really like this cast, honestly. But I mean, as a whole, I'd say Persona 3 is alright, I guess. The concept's neat. Some of the characters are genuinely great, but looking at it at the big picture, I was left with a lot to be desired. And this is just a story. Bunny, you know the drill.
Alright, so Persona 3 is pretty much what you expect. You run around dungeons, fighting enemies, collect personas to fuse new ones, gather items, and having to balance it all by living as a high school student. However, a lot has changed. So one of the biggest changes made here is instead of going to different dungeons or areas of a city to fight enemies, you mainly encounter them in here, Tartarus. Tartarus is essentially one big tower with over 200 floors, each with increasingly stronger enemies. There are limits to how far up you can go, but as you progress in the main story, you'll have access deeper to Tartarus. Once you get to the top, you'll fight the final boss. And, oh geez, I'll have to talk about Nyx, don't I? Don't worry, we'll get to him in a moment. Coming back to Tartarus, however, I honestly really like this inclusion. One of my biggest issues with the previous two games was that I constantly needed a guide to see where to go, especially since the location you had to go relied on knowing what the characters just said. Here, all you need to do is talk to Mitsuru or later on Fuka during the evening and tell them you want to go explore. This helps with grinding as well. The fact all enemy types are located in one area lets you gain as much experience as you need. In theory. You see, one of the more questionable additions is the condition of your party members. This means that depending on how your character is feeling, whether it be great, good, tired, or sick, will heavily affect things like your defense and attack during battles. Heck, if a party member is too tired and you leave back to the entrance of Tartarus, they'll completely leave you and go to their dorm. I'm very mixed about this mechanic. Not only does it limit your ability to grind as much, it can also be very tedious that you're having a character suddenly say they're exhausted while you're around stronger enemies. That being said, I do see some benefits to it as well. It definitely has motivated me to make all my party members as equally strong in case one does leave, and you could say it adds a sense of challenge that's not really present in JRPGs. It's definitely a fascinating system. Another thing kind of exclusive to P3 is, as said earlier, all characters except yourself are AI controlled. This wasn't too big of a deal, I'll be blunt and say that I made my playthrough on easy just in case. And even then, my party was really competent in what they were doing. Once we figured out the weaknesses of enemies, they were just taking them down one by one, all to do the all-out attack. I'm sure many of you know what this is already. Once all enemies are attacked either through a weakness they have or a critical hit, you get the choice to do this move. What it does is gather all your party members to go as mentioned, all out on the enemy. You really want to be doing this as much as you can because it's also one of the main ways you'd be getting your personas. After ending a fight with an all-out attack, you get to pick between a few cards. That be more money, experience, a new persona, or an item. In all honesty, Persona 3 heavily streamlined the gameplay to feel a lot snappier and faster thanks to these inclusions. But that's only half of what the game has to offer. The rest is unlike anything we've seen in both the previous games and JRPGs in general, the social links. I've been teasing about this for a while now, and how could I not? So for those who don't know what social links are in Persona, it's basically mini storylines dedicated for a character. Whether it be related to the main story, party member, or even some random person you meet, there is a social link for you to do. This can give a much deeper insight into a character's development and even adds a small arc for that character to overcome. The higher you level up a social link, the more powerful personas you can fuse, and the more you get to learn about said character. This is one of the best designs mechanic ever brought in my opinion. Not only does it help you further progress in Tartarus, but it also works wonders as a fun distraction from all the shadow hunting you do. There is a caveat to this, however. With Persona 3, everything is now structured as if you were having an entire school year. What this means is that anything you do will progress throughout the day, and social links are one of the many different activities you can do. Not to mention, in order to level up certain links, let alone unlock them, you need to have certain social stats in yourself. In P3's case, this is charm, knowledge, and courage. To increase them, you have to do different kinds of activities throughout those days, like karaoke, watch movies, study, etc. Which, keep in mind, will also spend a bit of your day. So in other words, you essentially have to strategically plan out how to make best use of your time. This further shows what makes the system so well made, but is also why I think Persona 3 is very poorly designed. I know, that's quite a take, but hear me out. The game does do a good job at explaining how the system works, and I didn't feel overwhelmed. But the problem was that there's not a whole lot to do, specifically at night. There's just not much you can do other than some karaoke or to study. No joke, once I maxed out my social stats, I just slept in the evenings or went to Tartarus when it was absolutely necessary. Oh, and not to mention their party members don't get their social links unlocked until the later half of the game. I absolutely despised this because my only options were people who I didn't feel much attachment to, or to do more karaoke. This is so dumb, because get this, by the time you unlock Fuka's social link, which is the earliest one you can get, you already have more than half the main cast as party members. Why do I need to wait until June 15th for the first social link? Why do I need to completely ace an exam to unlock Mitsuru's? Why the heck do I need to wait until January 8th for Aige's social link? It's just a few weeks away from fighting Nyx. And don't get me started with that social link breaking idea. Get this, if you don't hang out with someone for a very long time, you get punished, and your relationship with that person can end. And getting them back is already a challenge on its own. Just why? Why is this a thing? I don't recall this system being so bad. It's so easy to just forget about a social link. Why does the game need to punish me so hard for it? Now, I know you're all saying this game is meant to feel more realistic, and I can tell. From the conditions, to the social link system, to the darker tone, to waiting until New Year's to simply talk to my toaster waifu, this is easily a modern Persona game, but with an emphasis to make it more realistic. And you know what? That's one of my biggest complaints with P3. Look, I love Persona. From the characters, to the gameplay, to the absurdity it can go, I love all of it. But I think Persona 3 lacks what makes me adore the series. Its story became so dark and absurd, it just became comical in some cases. While I loved a handful of the characters, it wasn't as much compared to both what we had before and later on. The game was just starting to become really hard for me to get through. Not only because of every issue I had, but also because of this. This is Nyx, the final boss of the game. Single-handedly, the hardest boss in the series. What you have to do is empty his health bar. The problem is that after each time he was switched to a new arcana, those that represent the shadows from earlier. I spent so many hours just trying to figure out how to beat him, constantly grinding, trying new strategies, anything to finally say I finished the game. It was dreading, it was a pain, and I don't think I could do that same boss again. All in all, Persona 3. It definitely had some growing pains like 1, for better or worse. There's no denying that this game easily influenced what's to come later down in the series. Now, if you excuse me, I'm going to get some water. I need a breather.
Guess I'll go over the rest then. Before we get on to the reception and whatnot, I do want to mention very briefly the different versions that Persona 3 received. Let's start with FES. This was the point where the series started getting a more definitive version of its original release. Maybe adding a new character, another dungeon, or just quality of life improvements. FES is basically that. It adds a new chapter to the game called The Answer, and to put it simply, it's an epilogue that continues the lives of the party members 3 months after the events of the original game. It's not the most loved addition to this game to many fans. Me personally, it's alright. The story mainly revolves around knowing what happened after you defeated Nyx and, well, the death of this guy. Some new enemies appear and you have to figure out what's going on. It's mostly just more Persona 3 gameplay tied with a neat little story. Persona 3 Portable, however, is the more interesting of the 3 versions. Oh jeez, I completely forgot that remake. This was released in 2009 for the PlayStation Portable. A lot has been added, but also changed as well. It's a bit of a downgrade graphically, with the game feeling much more like a visual novel, and there's no 3D areas to explore except Tartarus. Despite all that, you can finally control your party members, and best of all, play as a female protagonist. This is really cool. Playing as her gives you a lot of changes like a different UI color and gives you a few more social links as well. Personally, I enjoyed Portable a lot more than FES, mainly because of how many issues it fixed. Sure, the story's still the same, and it is a lot more simplified since it was made for a console weaker than the PS2, but still. And well, as many of you know, there's gonna be a Persona 3 remake around 2024. I sadly didn't have the time to cover it here because obvious reasons. So, do we plan on reviewing it? Anyways, let's get to the reception. Persona 3 sold over 127,000 copies in its first week, with FES by 2008, it sold around 210,000. As for Portable, it sold 158,000 within the first month of release. Critically, this was once again a very positive entry for the series, with both versions of the games getting in the high 80s. A lot of praise went into the social links, the story, and the gameplay as a whole. And as you can tell, this was only the beginning of Atlus's milking of Persona. I kid you not, we got 3 anime movies. It's cast on Persona Q1 and 2, Persona 4 Arena Ultimax, a dancing spin-off, and so many more tie-ins like mangas, stage musicals, and merchandise. There's no denying this was a turning point, not only for Persona, but for Atlus as a company.
I know I have been very negative towards this entry. I know that this will definitely be one of my most controversial productions in my career, but I want you all to know that I'm doing this because I care for this franchise. Whether it be 3, 4, or 5, this is where I and many people have first been introduced to these games. This and the upcoming games all have a very special place in our hearts. There's a reason why Atlus mainly focuses on these 3, and I'm not here to downplay the accomplishments that P3 has done. Say what you want, but this entry was easily one of the best things the series could ever get. Without it, I don't think these next games would be as popular as they are now. Heck, it would have probably gotten a similar fate like Atlus's other franchise, eventually abandoned and never to be seen again. Just another experiment that felt too niche or similar to the Megami Tensei. So, thank you, Persona 3. You may not be my favorite entry, but you showed me what makes me love this series. With that said, I'm really happy to have you all support us to this point. Now, if you excuse me, I'll move on to what just might be the game that made me fall in love with the series. This is Bunny.
And Captain.
From Mintjoy Pictures.